Good morning. My name is Katie Merrill, and this is the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago on a very uninspiring gray Sunday here in Chicago. Today, before I introduce today's speaker, our tradition is to say something about our community or humanism. And I started to think about the thing I wanted to say, and often we read our mission statement or something. And I came across this quote from Einstein, which is, "Our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circle of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty." And that's not officially about humanism, but also I do think that's kind of, in the end, kind of what we all share. Or I think that's one of the core ideas of humanism, that what we do matters, what we understand and how we learn and think about acting on what we learn matters to the world. And so I'm giving us humanism from Einstein today. He may not like that, I don't know. Today's talk is from Glenn Branch, who's the Deputy Director at the National Center for Science Education. He's going to talk to us about teaching evolution. Glenn Branch is, as I mentioned, Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education, a nonprofit organization that defends the integrity of American science education against ideological interference. He is the author of numerous articles on evolution education and climate education and obstacles to them in such publications as Scientific American, American Educator, The American Biology Teacher, and the Annual Review of Genomics and Human Genetics. And the co-editor with Eugenie C. Scott of Not in Our Classrooms, Why Intelligent Design is Wrong for Our Schools. He received the Evolution Education Award for 2020 from the National Association of Biology Teachers. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and the sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of an ongoing programming related to both American culture and science. We're being live streamed, as some of you know, being recorded. After his presentation, we'll have a brief interlude, and after that, we'll have Q&A. If you're watching on the live stream, you'll be able to put your questions in the chat, and we'll pass them along. So with that, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Glenn. Thanks.
Thanks for that introduction, Katie. Again, I'm Glenn Branch, Deputy Director of the National Center for Science Education. In the wonderful world of nonprofits, that means something like utility infielder. Anyhow, I'm going to be talking today, as you see, about twists and turns in teaching evolution, with a special emphasis, insofar as I can manage it, on what humanists might need and want to know about evolution education in the United States. So to begin with, it's a tolerably notorious fact that scientists overwhelmingly accept evolution. About 98% of US scientists belonging to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, according to a 2014 survey conducted by the Pew Research Center. While the US public is not quite so squared away, only 65% of them in the same survey. What's the reason for this disconnect? In a book review published in the New York Times in 1989, a well-known scientist offered a handful of possible diagnoses, saying, if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked. But he didn't attempt to test these competing hypotheses. They can be tested, however. In a 2012 US survey, for example, the common ancestry of humans with other animals was accepted by only 48% of respondents. But the claim that the theory of evolution involves the common ancestry of humans with other animals was accepted by 72% of respondents. To understand what's going on here, we can look at the crosstabs. Slightly more than half of the evolution deniers lacked even a minimal understanding of evolution, insofar as they didn't agree that the theory of evolution involves the common ancestry of humans with other animals. Correspondingly, slightly less than half of the evolution deniers rejected evolution while displaying at least this minimal understanding of what it in fact involves. So about half of our evolution deniers are plausibly ignorant. Is it reasonable to think that the other half, about a quarter of the US population, are stupid, insane, or wicked? That would be disturbing if so. But there's a neglected alternative here. Someone can understand evolution to some degree, yet reject it if they're in the grips of an ideology that prevents them from accepting it. What could such an ideology be? Something religious in nature, sure, but we can be more exact than that. Evolution denial is largely driven by inerrantism, the view that the Bible is without error in all it teaches, not only matters of faith and morals, but also matters of history and science. And hey, about a quarter of the US population indeed reports taking an inerrantist view. Inerrantists can, and do, disagree about what the Bible in fact teaches. Every view to the northwest of theistic evolution on this chart is basically an inerrantist position, and they differ greatly in what they claim, both about the history of life, the age of the universe, and indeed the shape of the earth. But they all agree that God separately created living things after their own kind, which they take to mean that evolution between kinds, whatever they are, is impossible. Now, in a liberal, diverse, cosmopolitan society, we tolerate people having ideologies that we don't share or even deplore, so long as they don't attempt to impose them on others or otherwise to interfere with the legitimate interests of others. This is a statue of tolerance in a park in Brno in the Czechia. But in the case of inerrancy-driven evolution denial, creationism, there's been a long and inglorious history of such attempts in the US, and they've been focused on the place where evolution is aired more consistently and to a wider audience than anywhere else, the public school system, which retains remarkably few little red schoolhouses, despite the illustration. Now, when you think about evolution in the public schools, you might think first about the teachers involved in the high-profile court cases over the teaching of evolution that for almost a century now have shaped the public consciousness of the issue, starting with John T. Scopes, a young general science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. In 1925, a bill called the Butler Act, after its sponsor John Washington Butler, passed the Tennessee legislature and was signed into law. The new law made it illegal to teach in a state-supported school, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Scopes was recruited as the defendant in a test case by businessmen eager to promote Dayton, and the resulting trial was widely publicized. Scopes was convicted. The conviction was overturned on appeal on a technicality, yet the Butler Act remained on the books till 1967, exerting a chilling influence on the teaching of evolution in Tennessee and really nationally. Still thinking about teachers involved in legal cases over the teaching of evolution, here's Susan Epperson, who challenged Arkansas's Scopes-era ban on the teaching of evolution in the mid-1960s, after evolution started to make its way back into science textbooks in the United States. This was a result of the U.S. Trying to improve science education at the federal level as part of the space race with the Soviet Union. This case wound its way to the Supreme Court, which in 1968 ruled that the ban violated the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Scopes was still alive, and he welcomed the decision. And then the following year, Epperson and Scopes managed to have lunch together in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he was retired. Scopes died the following year. Still thinking about teachers involved in legal cases over the teaching of evolution, here's Donald Aguillard, the lead plaintiff in a case challenging a 1982 Louisiana state law requiring equal time for something called creation science, really a repackaging of the Genesis accounts of creation in supposedly scientific garb. And the idea of requiring its teaching was to balance, if you couldn't ban, the teaching of evolution in the state's public schools. This case also wound its way to the Supreme Court, which in 1987 ruled that the equal time for creationism law also violated the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And as you can see from the uncropped version of the last photograph, Aguillard was standing next to a brightly orange-clad Susan Epperson. Or finally, you might think of the teachers at Dover Area High School in Dover, Pennsylvania. When they were directed by their school board in 2004 to read a statement to their students deprecating evolution and recommending intelligent design, a repackaging of creationism that was hoped to survive constitutional scrutiny, they refused en masse. A lawsuit over the school board's actions had already been filed by 11 local parents, led by Tammy Kitzmiller, with the support of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the ACLU of Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia law firm Pepper Hamilton, and a plucky science education outfit, my employer, the National Center for Science Education. The folks you see here were the plaintiff's expert witnesses. Now, the Dover teachers weren't party to the trial in which the school board's actions were challenged as unconstitutional. They and their legal advisors decided that it would be counterproductive, but they were, of course, delighted to see the outcome of the case, Kitzmiller versus Dover, announced in letters 2 inches tall on the front page of the Harrisburg Patriot News. So judging from that whistle-stop tour of the history, you might conclude that throughout 100 years of controversy, all teachers have always been heroic defenders of evolution. If so, I wonder if you would be interested in purchasing this unique landmark in Brooklyn, New York. Truth be told, in the tales of the creationism evolution controversy, teachers are sometimes among the villains. In 1987, for example, Ray Webster, a social studies teacher at this junior high school in New Lenox, Illinois, is that close? I don't know where that is. It is. Webster was presenting creation science to his students, ostensibly to encourage them to explore alternative viewpoints. The district superintendent told him to knock it off, and Webster filed a suit against the district as a result, alleging that his constitutional rights had been violated. By the time the court ruled on Webster's case, 1989, the unconstitutionality of a teacher's presenting creation science had already been ruled by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional, and Webster could hardly have a constitutional right to engage in unconstitutional behavior. Plus, in general, school districts have a right to tell their teachers what and how to teach. In 1994, similarly, John Pelosa, a biology teacher at this high school in Mission Viejo, California, sued his school district for requiring him to teach evolution, which he contended violated his constitutional rights because, he said, evolution is a religious belief opposed to, and indeed the only alternative to, creationism. The district court didn't see any merit to this contention, writing, since the evolutionist theory is not a religion, to require an instructor to teach this theory is not a violation of the Establishment Clause. And Pelosa didn't fare any better on appeal. And like Webster, Pelosa did not have any constitutional right to preach creationism on the government's time clock. And in 2000, Rodney LeVake, a teacher at this high school in Faribault, Minnesota, refused to teach evolution without teaching, quote, the difficulties and inconsistencies of the theory. The district reassigned him to teach 9th grade general science instead, and LeVake sued the district, alleging, you guessed it, that his constitutional rights had been violated. Interestingly, unlike Webster and Pelosa, LeVake claimed that he was only seeking to teach the evidence for and the evidence against evolution, not to teach creationism. But the supposed evidence against evolution he cited clearly had its genesis, you should pardon the expression, in the creationist literature and lacked any scientific credibility. The tactic of offering scientifically unwarranted criticisms of evolution while trying to remain as silent as possible about any supposed alternative was pretty new at the time, but even then made a lot of sense because the prospects of intelligent design surviving constitutional scrutiny were not good, as the Kitzmiller trial demonstrated 5 years later in 2005. In LeVake's case, the district asked for and received summary judgment, so the case never reached trial. Undaunted, LeVake subsequently appealed the case to a Minnesota Court of Appeals, which upheld the ruling. The Minnesota Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review the case in 2001 and 2002, respectively, so that was the end of the line for LeVake. So we've looked at a small number of teachers who have been heroes of evolution education and a small number of teachers who have been villains, and if you're jumping to conclusions on the basis of either or both, then Dr. Zoidberg, the lobstery physician from Futurama, wants to have a word with you. If you want to understand what's really being taught about evolution in American public school classrooms, you need to do some survey research, or Polling, as they could say in Germany. As it happens, there have been apparently only 3 nationally representative surveys of science educators with regard to evolution. Actually, it's 4 now. Let me emphasize national and representative. There have been a lot of these surveys confined to more or less narrow geographic areas, like individual states. There have been a lot that have used convenience samples, like surveying all the teachers who happen to attend a particular conference. But again, only 3, now 4, that can claim to give an accurate picture of the state of evolution education nationally. The first of these dates from 1939 and 1940. The lead researcher on the survey, Oscar Riddle, was a distinguished zoologist who was also deeply concerned about helping teachers resist, as his biographer put it, the anti-evolutionary pressure of dogmatic religious groups. Riddle was also a co-founder of the National Association of Biology Teachers in the wake of the Scopes trial, and he was also a staunch humanist, receiving the American Humanist Association's Humanist of the Year Award for 1958. Riddle and his team mailed about 15,000 questionnaires to high school biology teachers across the U.S., receiving about 3,200 responses, and the questionnaire asked a lot of questions about various topics. But teaching, and not teaching, organic evolution was a major part of it. The survey found that about 10% of high school biology teachers personally rejected evolution. Even worse, the survey found that only about 54% of high school biology teachers were teaching evolution as a central principle of biology, which it is. Even some of these teachers were still not willing to teach human evolution, which was the main focus, after all, of the Scopes-era legislation like the Butler Act. And so, all told, only about 51% were teaching evolution without compromise. Remember that number, 51%. Fast forward to 2005, when the Kitzmiller trial was underway in the federal courthouse in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. 100 miles to the northwest, a couple of parents with children in the public schools were paying close attention. But they weren't just any parents. They were political scientists at Penn State who professionally worked on education policy. Michael Berkman and Eric Plutzer realized that there hadn't been a national survey of high school biology teachers addressing evolution since the Riddle survey of 1939-1940. With a student, Juliana Sandel-Pacheco, Berkman and Plutzer conducted such a survey in 2007, thus giving the first national look at evolution education in 67 years. Among the headline results, as reported, were that 28% of public high school biology teachers were presenting evolution forthrightly, the way we want them to, while 13% were presenting creationism as scientifically credible, and 60% were, while not presenting creationism as scientifically credible, were skimping on their teaching of evolution in one way or another. Plutzer and I later went back to the 2007 data and realized that the first two categories I just mentioned were not mutually exclusive. So we proposed a new typology according to which teachers reported endorsing evolution and whether they reported endorsing creationism. That results in a 4-fold categorization that's mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Every teacher is in exactly one box. We can nickname these teachers. Eve presents evolution as settled science, giving no credence to creationism. Mimi sends mixed messages, saying that evolution is accepted by scientists, but saying there's something to creationism too. Avery avoids discussing the scientific standing of evolution and creationism altogether. Craig says that creationism is good science, but evolution is not. Now, you might think that this makes things look better. In 2007, we have a majority of teachers, 51%, who are Eves, presenting evolution as settled science. But remember that the Riddle survey found that only about 51% of teachers were presenting evolution as a central principle of biology. Does that mean that there was no progress at all in 67 years? No. The Riddle survey had a sampling bias and a response bias, making it likely that teachers who presented evolution as a central principle of biology were overrepresented. The questions used in the surveys aren't exactly comparable. And these questions, of course, only measure a small part of what makes for good or bad evolution education. But still, yikes. In 2019, one of the researchers from the Berkman survey of 2007 and staff from NCSC collaborated on a partial replication of that 2007 survey, and we published a report on it about 4 years ago in 2020 in the journal Evolution, Education, and Outreach. Those are the proud parents, Eric Plutzer of Penn State, me, and my colleague Ann Reed. Good news. In 2007, the average number of class hours devoted to teaching evolution in general was 9.8 hours, with human evolution in particular only receiving 4.1 hours. In 2019, the average number of hours devoted to teaching evolution was up to 12.4 hours. That's a rise of 25%. And human evolution was up to 7.7 hours, a rise of 90%, almost doubling. Of course, it wouldn't be true progress unless the increased discussion of evolution was scientifically accurate. What were the teachers saying about evolution? We evaluated this through our fourfold typology, which I display again here. Eve is evolution as settled science, which is what we want to see. Mimi, mixed messages. Avery, avoidance. And Craig, creationism advocacy. More good news. There was definite progress between 2007 and 2019, with 51% of Eves going up to 67% in 2019. This is matched by drops in the Mimi teachers, the Avery teachers, and the Craig teachers. So that's 16 percentage points in just 12 years. With about 4 million students enrolled in high school biology classes in the public school system in any given year, the gains for accurate, complete, and honest evolution education are clearly enormous. It's still a matter of concern, of course, that so many of these teachers, more than 1 in 6, are presenting creationism as scientifically credible. Why is that? Well, our go-to explanations, remember, are ignorance and ideology. Let's start with ignorance. To assess teachers' awareness of the scientific consensus on evolution, we ask them to estimate, by quintile, what proportion of scientists think that humans and other living things have evolved over time. Remember, according to that 2014 survey, 98% do, so the correct quintile would be 81 to 100%. High school biology teachers did pretty well on this question, with 71% selecting the correct quintile, 92% selecting the top 2 quintiles. We actually don't have such a fine-grained analysis for the general public, but in that 2014 survey, only 65% of the general public agree that scientists generally agree with evolution. So it seems that ignorance is not playing a big role in explaining the high school teachers' results. How about ideology? Yeah. The personal religious beliefs of teachers apparently play a large role in their choice of what themes to emphasize in the classroom. Presented with the options used by Gallup in its polling on evolution and creationism, 4% of Eves, 12% of Mimis, 25% of Averys, and a whopping 60% of Craigs in 2019 preferred the creationist option. And it should be unsurprising, given what I said earlier about creationism being driven primarily by inerrantism, to see a connection here too. Only 3% of Eves, but 16% of Mimis, 11% of Averys, and a substantial 32% of Craigs agreed with the Bible is the actual word of God and is to be taken literally word for word. Even here, there is just encouraging news. In the 2007 survey, 16% of all the teachers surveyed agreed with the creationist option when presented with the Gallup question, while in the 2019 survey, only 10.5% did, showing that creationists are decreasingly likely to be represented among high school biology teachers. By the way, the decrease in creationism among high school biology teachers significantly outpaced the decrease in creationism among the general public, which fell from 46% in 2007 to 40% in 2019, according to Gallup. So that's a drop of more than a third among the teachers, but only a drop of less than a sixth among the general public. But the personal religious beliefs for teachers isn't, and really can't be, responsible for the entire shift. Since NCSC, where I work, was intimately involved in the Kitzmiller case, having assembled the legal team representing the plaintiffs, provided the expert witnesses, and supported the legal team throughout the trial, it would be nice to think that the sweeping legal victory played a role. Parenthetically, I'll note that Barbara Forrest, one of those expert witnesses, received the American Humanist Association Humanist Pioneer Award in 2009, while NCSC's executive director at the time, Eugenie C. Scott, received AHA's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2014, and the judge presiding over the case, John E. Jones III, received AHA's Humanist Religious Liberty Award in 2008. A nice show of gratitude from the humanist community. Alas for the hypothesis that Kitzmiller versus Dover made a big difference in the teaching of evolution, the evidence doesn't point that way. In 2003, my pal Randy Moore administered a questionnaire about the legal issues of teaching evolution and teaching creationism in the public schools to a convenient sample of Minnesota high school biology teachers and found that a large majority was already aware that it's unconstitutional to teach creationism in the public schools. So probably Kitzmiller did not change anything in this respect. Instead, in the study of the 2019 survey, we concluded that improvements in the treatment of evolution in state science standards played a major role in producing the classroom improvements in evolution. And to explain how, I'll need to talk a bit about state science standards. State science standards are documents that specify what knowledge and skills students are expected to acquire. Pretty much as soon as they started to be introduced across the country in the 1980s as part of the push for standards-based education, it was clear to everybody that if evolution was going to be in the state science standards, it was going to be more likely to be in the classroom. That's not only because state science standards determine the content of statewide science examinations, but also because they set the agenda for pre-service and in-service teacher coursework, affect the content of biology textbooks, and provide guidelines for the science curricula. And of course, they can act as a shield for beleaguered teachers. I understand you're unhappy that I'm teaching evolution, but you know, it's in the state science standards. So creationists were quick to tinker with standards to advance their cause. As early as 1995, the Alabama State Board of Education inserted a provision in the state science standards that required evolution not to be presented dogmatically, and then used that to require a disclaimer describing evolution as a theory to be affixed to all biology textbooks. Visible attempts to undermine the treatment of evolution state science standards have occurred across the country over the last 25 years in at least 20 states, shown here in red, including states you might not have guessed what's going on, Hawaii, and I might have forgotten a few. Who's waging these battles? Frequently, evolution's foes are on the State Board of Education, especially in states where the board is elected. Alabama, as we've seen, Kansas, and Texas, where for years a creationist faction held sway on the board, including former chair Don McElroy, who famously explained what he saw as his role: someone's got to stand up to experts. Sometimes the anti-evolutionists are in the Department of Education, with the most conspicuous recent case being the former superintendent of public instruction in Arizona, Dan Douglas, who tried to downplay evolution in a new set of science standards there in 2018. She was ultimately unsuccessful and was voted out of office. Sometimes they're in the legislature. In Iowa, Sandy Salmon introduced a string of bills that would have prevented the state from adopting a new set of standards, would have reversed the adoption of those standards, would have prevented anyone from using those standards, and so on. Fortunately, none of these bills was successful. And of course, there's the grassroots opposition to the treatment of evolution state science standards. It usually doesn't take place in person, so we don't get to enjoy signs like this. More typically, it occurs when the public is invited, as it should be, to comment on draft science standards, and it can be very entertaining or dismaying to read the comments on evolution. Seldom will the grassroots rally as much as they did in Kansas in 2013, where a creationist group filed a federal lawsuit against the state for adopting a new set of evolution-friendly standards on the ground that it constituted the establishment of a non-theistic religious worldview. They lost at every step in their court battle. But even when there haven't been such battles, there's no reason for complacency. In 2009, two of my colleagues assess the treatment of evolution in state science standards. The states marked with the darker colors were doing worse. There have been some changes in the last 15 years, most of them, I'm pleased to say, for the better. The biggest development in state science standards in the last 10 years was the release of the Next Generation Science Standards, NGSS, in 2013. These are a model set of standards developed by a consortium of non-profit organizations in 26 states, including Illinois, using up-to-date science and equally up-to-date pedagogy. The NGSS highlight biological evolution, unity and diversity, as a disciplinary core idea, important thing, of the life sciences at the middle and high school levels. 20 states plus the District of Columbia have adopted the NGSS, that includes Illinois, and a further 25 states have adopted standards based on the same evolution-friendly framework on which the NGSS are based. NGSS states, it turns out, were not especially hospitable to the teaching of evolution in 2007, when their teachers were found in our survey to be a shade less likely to endorse evolution and not creationism than the national average. But by 2019, they were a shade more likely to endorse evolution and not creationism than the national average, 69% as opposed to 67%. While a variety of explanations are possible, teachers in NGSS states reported having taken more pre-service and more in-service coursework in evolution than did their colleagues elsewhere. These are pre-service teachers at Cornell University. And that suggests that the increased expectations of the standards impelled both novice and veteran teachers to upgrade their content knowledge of evolution and consequently to be able to teach it better and to be more confident about teaching it. So it seems that substantial improvements in science education, even for a socially controversial topic such as evolution, are attainable by improving the state science standards and equipping teachers with the wherewithal to comply with them. That's something we're celebrating, and certainly nothing to rue. Sorry, it's terrible. But there's still work to be done. I've been talking mainly about high school biology teachers, since evolution is typically presented most thoroughly in high school biology classes. But evolution and its components usually appear first in middle school life and earth sciences classes, where it provides a vital basis for future learning, as in the NGSS seen here. There are heroes and villains among middle school science teachers too. Bertha Vasquez is a recently retired middle school science teacher in Miami who runs the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, affiliated with the Richard Dawkins Foundation and the Center for Inquiry, which has been providing evolution education workshops to middle school educators specifically since 2015. But John Freshwater taught 8th grade science in this Mount Vernon, Ohio middle school till 2011, when he was sacked, in part because he was presenting, just as Rodney LeVake sought to present, what he described as evidence for and against evolution, where the against part was based, of course, on crude creationist propaganda. The Freshwater affair got a lot of press attention for other reasons, since he was accused of engaging in religious proselytizing of various forms in his classroom. Especially disturbing were the allegations that Freshwater improperly used a high-voltage electrostatic device to mark students' arms with a cross. Yikes. But again, Dr. Zoidberg admonishes us that's a pretty small sample. And until recently, the total number of middle school science teachers surveyed with respect to evolution was about 110, distributed among half a dozen different studies. Fortunately, our survey in 2019 included a nationally representative sample of middle school science teachers too. The NCSE Penn State team published a report on the middle school results, a sibling to the previous report on the high school results, also in Evolution Education and Outreach. And here are the proud parents, me, I got to be the lead author this time, Eric Putzer from Penn State, and again, my colleague, Ann Reed. Now, middle school teachers, including junior high school teachers, so we're talking teachers with students grades 6 through 9, ages 11 through 15. These teachers are the Swiss Army knives of science teachers. They're generalists, with most of their classes covering a mixture of earth and space sciences, life sciences, chemistry, physics, sometimes some technology too. So it wasn't surprising that only 45% of middle school science teachers reported devoting any class time to human evolution, and only 60% to evolution in general. This is in comparison to 78% and 91% of high school biology teachers. On average, evolution gets 17.2 class hours in a high school biology class, but only about 9.1 class hours in a middle school science class. But keep in mind that not all middle school science teachers are expected to be teaching evolution. If they're teaching, a kind of physics class, they wouldn't be. So if we restrict comparison to those teachers who reported devoting at least one class hour to evolution, the difference narrows, 18.6 class hours versus 14.6. That is, when middle school science teachers cover evolution at all, they spend only 22% less time on it than their high school colleagues. Are they emphasizing the scientific consensus on evolution? Again, restricting comparison to the middle school teachers devoting at least one class hour to evolution, we found that a bare majority of them are Eves, 52%, while about equal numbers are Mimi's and Avery's, 9.3 of them are Craig's. That's actually pretty similar to the high school numbers from 2007, but not as good as the high school numbers from 2019. Here's the comparison with the high school numbers from 2019. It's not surprising that high school biology teachers are doing a better job at emphasizing the scientific consensus on evolution than are their middle school colleagues. Can we sort out the causes of this divergence? To some extent. Returning to our go-to explanations of ignorance and ideology, middle school teachers are clearly more likely to be ignorant of the extent of the scientific consensus on evolution, even though a solid majority of them estimate the level of consensus in the correct quintile. Again, we don't have such fine-grained detail for the general public, but it's safe to say that the middle school science teachers are doing better. As for ideology, when we compare their personal beliefs, we find that middle school science teachers are twice as likely as high school biology teachers, about 20 to 11%, to accept the creationist option in the Gallup question, although they're only half as likely to accept as the general public, 20% to 40%. So ideology is also playing a role. We lack a time series of data for middle school science teachers, so we can't say for sure that there's been progress there. But given the remarkable progress on the part of their high school counterparts over just 12 years, it seems plausible that there's been a similar, if smaller, improvement at the middle school level for the exact same reasons. Prediction is uncertain, especially about the future, but let me offer a three-part forecast. First, I don't think we're going to see any significant anti-evolution policy enacted, whether in the form of legislation or in attacks on standards. That's not to say, of course, that there won't be attempts to enact such policies. I feel confident that there will be, especially given the Supreme Court's recent decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton, which weakened the constitutional separation of church and state, and in the process casually overturned the half-century of case law underlying the decisions that repulsed creationist encroachments on evolution education. In 2021, Mary Bentley in Arkansas sought to allow teachers to teach creationism, quote, as a theory of how the earth came to exist, which, spoiler, it isn't. Still, her bill passed the House of Representatives there before being defeated on the narrowest of votes, 3-3, in a Senate committee. But if such a bill is enacted, as it might be judging from that near miss, and a teacher tries his or her luck, the law will be swiftly challenged in the courts, and it will be hard to defend, even in the wake of Kennedy versus Bremerton. Second, it's going to be a long time before the evolution wars end, owing to the decentralization of American education. With 13,500 odd local school districts having primary responsibility for curriculum instruction, this map shows the district boundaries in the lower 48. Improvements in evolution education are inevitably going to be slow, scattered, and incremental. But third and finally, the signs for the long term are promising. Look at this graph of American public opinion on evolution from 1985 to 2020. This is one of the longest time series we have. The gray shading indicates the 99% confidence interval. For the last 14 years, since 2012, we can be confident that acceptance of evolution was more common among the American public than rejection. Creationism may not be on the ropes yet, but certainly trending that way. There are two basic approaches to improving public acceptance and understanding of evolution, corresponding to our now familiar arch nemeses, ignorance and ideology. First, increasing the amount and quality of teacher coursework in evolution and pedagogical methods for teaching evolution effectively. And we've seen how improvements in state science standards in the U.S. can drive such increases. The organized humanist community has been supporting such effort, and in particular, I'm going to give a shout out to Jason Wiles of Syracuse University, a member of the American Humanist Association's Board of Directors, whose research on evolution education, as well as his efforts to resist creationism in his home state of Arkansas, recently won him a Friend of Darwin Award from the National Center for Science Education. Bear in mind, though, that although formal education is really important, so is informal education through venues like natural history museums. This is the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, when a traveling exhibit on evolution was visiting, and through the media. And efforts to increase the amount and quality of evolution in informal education deserve support too. The second approach to improving public understanding and acceptance of evolution involves the ideologies that stand in the way of teaching evolution, sometimes carrying signs. Of course, it's neither possible nor desirable to try to directly change the ideologies of the teachers, parents, and members of the community who harbor ideological reservations about evolution. But it is possible to make evolution less threatening to such people. For example, by showing them that they're people who share their values yet accept the science, such as Francis Collins, the former director of the National Institutes of Health and an evangelical Christian, or Kenneth R. Miller, not only the co-author of a popular series of high school biology textbooks, but also a Catholic. A different approach, and one more suited to a secular group like the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago, pick one at random, is to make evolution less threatening by appealing to widely shared values that are neither religious nor anti-religious through, for example, Darwin Day events, which show that learning about evolution can be interesting and exciting and accompanied by scrumptious cake. In 1993, Robert Stevens, another Friend of the Darwin Award recipient and another humanist, saw the need for a sustained outreach effort to demonstrate widespread acceptance of evolution and support of evolution education. And his idea was Darwin Day. Darwin Day celebrations have become a fixture across the country and around the globe, thanks in part to humanist organizations' role in coordinating and publicizing it. The National Center for Science Education is active on three main fronts. First, we act as a crisis clinic for those facing challenges to evolution education in their schools, districts, and states. We've been doing that for a long time, but that, of course, is the new office. Since climate education is now under similar attack, we added it to our portfolio a few years ago, and I think 14 years ago. Time flies. Second, as you've seen, we conduct high quality and high impact research on science education, including those two surveys on evolution education I discussed with you today. Also two similar surveys on climate education, a recent study on climate change and state science standards, and a new survey on evolution, climate change, and the nature of science, completed earlier this year, but I have not yet seen the top lines. So I'm hoping for good news. Third, NCSA has a program aimed at preparing teachers to effectively teach socially but not scientifically controversial topics, such as evolution and climate change, coordinating high-quality programming for pre-service and in-service teachers across the country. At NCSA, we're working as hard and as smart as we can to defend and promote the teaching of evolution and climate change. We value our alliances with the humanist community. We welcome your support, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thanks for your attention and interest.
Thanks so much, Glenn. That was really interesting and inspiring and worrisome all at once. So we're going to take our brief little interlude, and for people here in the room, we're going to pass a basket. And if you have some cash in your pocket that you want to put in there, that'd be great. And there's also QR codes at the back that lead you to a website where you can give online. If you're online, there's information in the YouTube chat that explains how you could donate. We love you to give $10 if you can, but we are happy for you to give whatever it is you have available. And after the interlude, we'll have questions and answers. Thank you. So now is the time when you get to ask your provocative and thoughtful question. And just as a small point, I feel it's really important to point out the questions end in question marks. Statements end in periods, and those are different, and those are interesting, and those are great at coffee hour, but today we're going to aim for questions that Glenn will answer for us. So it looks like we have a question here, and if you're online, you can put your question in the chat, and they will come to me, and I'll read them out loud. Thanks.
Glenn, thank you for the talk and for what you do. This is a great, important thing that you're doing. So I had a question about the surveys that you're doing. So how do you make sure that there is no, like, are you trying to make, when you're doing the surveys, are you trying to make sure that you are asking it without the bias part? You said there was bias in the earlier research. Like, how do you keep that out of the questions?
So you're asking how do we avoid
Like when you ask the question, like depending on how you ask the question.
in surveys, yes.
Yes.
Well, we do have the advantage of working with Eric Plutzer, who is a political scientist and survey methodologist expert. So, he's a pro and will tend to defer questions about bias. We do look for demographic bias. So for teachers, we have a fairly good understanding of nationally how many teachers are male, female, their ethnicities, their genders, and so forth. And we can kind of look to see if there's any kind of demographic bias and see if, maybe men don't respond as avidly to surveys as women. Not the case. So when we're in a position to check for bias, we do. And when we're not, we can't.
So I'm going to read an online question. What limitations are there in other countries on teaching evolution?
Varies greatly. In most of the developed world, evolution is taught matter-of-factly and without all the fuss that we have in the United States. Part of that is because creationism is distinctively an Anglo-American phenomenon. It's not exclusively, but distinctively. And part of the reason is our decentralized education system. The joke is that the French Minister of Education knows in her office in Paris what page of what book is open in what classroom on any given day. Not so here. Outside, getting into less developed territory, sometimes evolution is not taught or is taught badly, often for ideological reasons. This is true of much of the Islamic world, although not all of it. And as you might expect, for example, evolution gets to be taught more in theologically liberal countries like Indonesia and a lot less in, say, Saudi Arabia. And so one could write a book chapter, and I have, about comparative evolution education across the country, and it's a big area and a great question.
Glenn, thanks for coming out here. It's great to see you. So one of the first graphs you showed, the 98% of scientists, I assume that was in the United States, accepted evolution. So I'm wondering about the 2% because of all the evidence that there is for evolution. And do the 2% not understand the scientific method as scientists? Or is this a purely religious thing? And also, is this a worldwide phenomena, or with that graphic of 98 and 2?
So it was a sample of members of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And not all those people are necessarily scientists. William Jennings Bryan, one of the prosecutors in the Scopes trial, had actually joined the AAAS in 1923, mainly as a talking point. So we don't know that all of those people are scientists. It's also the case that when they drilled down a little, they found that 99% of research scientists accepted evolution. But they didn't really go conduct individual interviews or anything like that with the 2% of who didn't accept evolution. So we don't know. My guess would be that in their cases it is religious.
I'm going to read another one from online. I attended a small private Christian school in the South. I was not taught evolution at all. Actually, the only education I had on evolution was the so-called Creation Museum as a child. What percent of these results, of the results of educators being surveyed are from public schools versus private schools?
All of the educator surveys were from public schools. Private schools, you have something of a mix. You do have fundamentalist Christian ones, like the questioner presumably attended, where evolution is not taught, or it is taught, but only in a way to make it clear that's wrong. But of course, there are many private schools, indeed private Christian schools, with Catholic or Lutheran or Episcopal sponsors, where evolution is taught matter-of-factly and without fuss. So some variance. We don't have a lot of data on private schools, partly because it's a smaller population. Only about 2% of American school children are in private schools, I believe.
Well, thank you for your work, Glenn. What I understood from the presentation is that because with state standards, teachers do not have free speech rights under the First Amendment. Do you see that as something that is going to be challenged, or do you see challenges to that? And a second question, I guess, has to do with, what I'll say is some of the dark uses of evolutionary theory, that it has been used to justify racism, that there are superior races, that people in remote parts of the world are primitive and haven't evolved. And just would like you to respond to that if you still see evolution being used to support racism. And just a third one, great beard, what happened to it?
Okay, so the first part of that question, or first question within that series of questions, so that there's a slight confusion here. So teachers generally do not have First Amendment rights because on the time clock they are the government, and the government doesn't have First Amendment rights because it's the government. It's citizens who have First Amendment rights. So there are some kind of exceptions to this. If they're speaking on matters of urgent public concern, something. This is a highly litigated area, and I think it's in some flux. The leading case is something called Garcetti, and I believe it's under challenge. So I'm not a lawyer. But state science standards don't have anything to do with that. That's just a function of what government employees get to do and don't get to do when they're on the time clock. There certainly is a history of evolution being pressed into service in the causes of, you name it, racism, sexism, ethnocentrism. And that continues to happen, but very much on the fringes. What you don't find is the scientific establishment getting behind those efforts, as once to its discredit it did. And third part wasn't really a question, was it? So, beard. Yeah, I don't know. I grow it until it bugs me, and then I shave it off and start over again.
My question is similar to the one that was asked on YouTube chat. My original question was, what are comparable numbers in Europe in terms of, school teachers and their evolutionary beliefs? But I modified it while I was standing here. In Europe, it seems that they've become much more religious. And do you think that, our beliefs will win over by a war of attrition as America becomes less religious? There's an increase in the number of nuns or people who don't believe in any kind of religion. Is that the long haul way to win this?
I don't have any figures on creationism among European teachers offhand. I don't think anyone bothers, which is suggestive that there's a low level. And yeah, I do think that trends are toward secularism. So social scientists who work on secularization theory used to tie themselves into knots with the United States because they'd come up with these lovely explanations of why Europe and the rest of the developed world is getting less and less religious over time. And then they'd come over to the United States and say, well, and then they'd have to start, putting epicycles on the theory to get it to work right. And it turns out that you maybe don't need those epicycles, it's just has been taking longer. So I think that we are seeing less and less religiosity in the United States, and that the long-term prospects of creationism not being such a problem will reduce in consequence. I don't expect this to become a real big culture war issue, though, especially as compared to things going on with history and social studies.
So the live feed is dead, unfortunately, so there's no more questions from them. So I'm going to ask one last question, unless anybody else here has them, which is, what gives you the most hope? Like, what is it that you guys talk about that says, see, we did this in Delaware, now everyone will do it? Or these kind of leaders, or just all of us old people dying and young people coming up with better ideas? I don't know.
Well, I think what gives me a lot of hope is meeting classroom teachers. It's been quite a while since I was a student myself. I have a child, but he's graduated college. But I meet a lot of teachers who are just so sharp and so dedicated and so committed and so underpaid that knowing people like that are out there doing their best to educate their students about, a central principle of the biological sciences against all kinds of real and perceived pressures. That gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you so much. We tend to close with a quote, and today's quote is from Neil deGrasse Tyson. I am driven by two main philosophies: know more today about the world than I knew yesterday, and lessen the suffering of others. Thanks.